Hello, everyone. Welcome to the stay-at-home lecture for tonight. And I'm glad to have you all here. It is 7 o'clock, so let's go ahead and begin. Appreciate you all being here tonight. Again, thank you all for joining me tonight for another Society for the History of Medicine and Health Professions Stay-at-Home lecture. I'm Tim Nutt, Director of the Historical Research Center at the Archives Department of the UAMS Library. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about how the state's first medical school came into existence. Before we do that, I have a few things that I'd like to go over with you tonight. As usual, as I mentioned, this stay-at-home lecture is sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and the Health Professions, which is the Friends group for the Historical Research Center. If you are not a member of the society, I hope you will consider joining. The membership dues are pretty inexpensive, and I have a link up on the screen that will take you to the membership form that you can print out, send in a check if you'd like to do that, or you can just go to the PayPal link, paypal.me/shmhp, if you'd like to just pay online and skip the form and go into that long URL that's on your screen. The membership dues are pretty inexpensive, $15 for an individual or $5 for a student membership. Now, in addition to lectures like this, the Society also sponsors an annual dinner and lecture. Of course, we were not able to have our dinner yet this year. We're still hoping that we can present that to you later this year. Just a few notes, a few additional notes before we begin. Everyone's audio is on mute, so no one can hear you if you try to ask a question verbally. There is a chat box that you're more than welcome to use. Ask your question. You don't have to wait until the end of the presentation to ask a question. If something comes, an idea comes to you while you're listening, please feel free to go ahead and put something in the chat box. Now, the chat box, whatever you write will be seen by everyone. So, and you are able to change that if you'd like to just send someone a message, or if you have something to say to me, you can do that privately as well and through the chat box. Now, before we jump into the presentation, I do want to highlight a couple of our society's board members. First, we have Dr. Richard Clark, whom I believe is watching here tonight. Dr. Clark is one of the charter members of the society. He is when it was founded in 1981, and he has served pretty much continuously on the board since then. He is a retired UAMS faculty member in anesthesiology, and he is one of the society's most dedicated and persistent supporters. And we are glad to have him on our side and not against us. And then I'm also highlighting Dr. Trish Wright, who is in the UAMS College of Nursing. She serves as our society president. She is in her second term in that role. Trish has been a steady leader, especially during these last few months. And so I just want to take an opportunity tonight to thank both Dr. Clark and Dr. Wright for their hard work on behalf of the society. Now, as I mentioned, I am director of the UAMS Historical Research Center. Our mission is to preserve the history of UAMS as well as the history of health sciences in Arkansas. Now, the HRC, as we call it, the Historical Research Center, is the only archives in the state that is dedicated to preserving the health sciences. Our main goal is to preserve materials that focus on the health sciences in the state. We were established in 1978, and we're home to all sorts of artifacts, everything you can probably think of, as well as photographs and archival collections, including the papers, the professional papers of Dr. Joycelyn Elders and Dr. Edith Irby Jones, among others. So if you have any materials dealing with any aspect of the health sciences in Arkansas, I'd love to talk with you, love to converse with you and convince you to donate those materials to the Historical Research Center. And speaking of the Historical Research Center and materials that we want to collect, we do want to document this period in our history, this time of the pandemic of COVID-19. So we'd love to have any flyers, pamphlets reminding us to wash our hands or stay 6 feet apart, diaries that you might be keeping, illustrations that you might be drawing while you're quarantining or stuck inside, photographs of yourself in a mask, or even of celebrations that you've had while maintaining your social distance. You know, your experiences are really important during this pandemic, are really important and will be important to future researchers. So I hope you'll consider gathering up materials, documenting your own experiences during this time, and consider donating them to the Historical Research Center. And if anyone wants to take all those fabric masks that you no longer want to wear, and after you wash them, if someone wants to make us a quilt out of those, we would gladly accept that. And another thing, we're going to get to our presentation here in a second, but I also want to mention a new exhibit that we are doing, and I'd love to have your help on. The exhibit we're hoping to open in later this year, maybe in July or August, and we are going to highlight children's toys that have a medical theme. So, for example, a Dr. Barbie, for example, or the emergency board game, as you see on your screen. And we will even take some Fisher-Price hospital figurines from when you were a child, or a Cabbage Patch doll, anything like that. So we're trying to present how the medical community, how the health sciences world was and is presented to children. And also, if you have a photo of you playing with a toy like that, we would love to use the toy and the photograph in the exhibit. You don't have to donate it to us. We will gladly borrow it from you and return it. And my contact information is on the screen if you'd like to do that. So I hope you will consider that. Finally, the society had recently, the boards voted to extend these lectures through September. They were supposed to end in July, and so we have extended them through September 17th, and they'll remain the first and third Thursdays of the month at 7 o'clock and at 8 o'clock. Now, you'll notice on your screen, before I move on, you'll notice that link on your screen, that's going to be good for all of the presentations. So keep that link handy and you'll be able to join any of our presentations that are coming up. And speaking of that presentation, I'm going to draw your attention to August 20th, and that's going to be by Mary Ryan and Bill Russell, and they're going to be talking about a family practice, the Russell Doctors and the Evolving Business of Medicine, 1799 to 1989. And right now, the University of Arkansas Press has the book out. It's just been released. They have a discounted price for it. So I encourage you to go to uapress.com, order a copy of the book at the discounted rate, and read it and join us on August 20th when Mary and Bill will talk about that. William Lindsay, the other author of the book, will not be able to join us that night, but I'm glad that we'll have Mary and Bill Russell there. So enough of that. Let's get on to the presentation that you actually turned in for tonight. So today, you know, we all know UAMS is a world-class medical center, a comprehensive health sciences center educating tomorrow's doctors and other health professionals. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, employer in the state of Arkansas, has about 10,000 employees, and it impacts every section of Arkansas, from its extensive main campus in Little Rock to its northwest campus in Fayetteville, and then the regional centers that are scattered throughout the state. So it's hard to imagine Arkansas without UAMS, but when it was founded in 1879, the future was anything but bright. The early years of the medical school were filled with uncertainty and controversy, and some of that uncertainty, of course, still lingers today through financial support. Yet the last 140 plus years have also been filled with vision groundbreaking research and leadership. Now, there's no way that I can fit 140 plus years into an hour, less than an hour now. So I'm going to just give you a brief history of UAMS in about 45 minutes or less. Now, as I mentioned, what we now know is UAMS was founded in 1879. In the 1870s, Little Rock counted around 25 physicians and surgeons as residents. These doctors had not received their education in Arkansas because Arkansas did not have a medical school. So many of them, most of them, had been educated back east or had simply apprenticed with a physician and learned what they needed to learn and opened up their own practice. The closest medical schools that Arkansas residents could attend would have been St. Louis, which was founded in 1840, the first medical school west of the Mississippi River, or Tulane in New Orleans, which had been founded in 1834. The physicians in Pulaski County, the small number that they were a cohesive group, at least for a little while. In fact, the Little Rock and Pulaski County Medical Society had been organized in 1866, the second such society in the state. P.O. Hooper and James Dibbrell and other leaders in the Pulaski County Medical Society would be the same ones, those same leaders in the medical field that would later establish the school 13 years later. But before we get into the actual founding of the school, we have to get a little background about the founders. Now, in 1870, the Arkansas State Medical Association was established by Drs. Hooper, Augustus L. Brysocker, Claiborne Watkins, and Roscoe Jennings, among a few others. But in 1872, a controversy split the society, and it involved the admission of a hot springs physician, and that debate after it erupted, it engulfed, as I mentioned, the medical society, and it eventually fractured the Arkansas State Medical Association. So both the county and the state medical associations were split over this debate. It became acrimonious after a while, and in 1873, Roscoe Jennings and P.O. Hooper left the Pulaski County Medical Society in protest and formed the College of Physicians and Surgeons, a counter organization to the Pulaski County Medical Society. You're going to hear about the College of Physicians and Surgeons later on, but it's not going to be the same College of Physicians and Surgeons that we're talking about right now. Now, this fracture that occurred in the County Medical Association eventually led to the split in the state organization and the formation of the Arkansas Medical Society in 1875. So you had these two groups that were operating independently until 1879, when they settled their differences and they merged so they could establish the medical school. Now, in the spring of 1879, after they had pretty much worked out all of their agreements, that's not to say that they were best friends, but they worked together long enough to begin a discussion about a medical school. They all agreed that there was a need, and there was it was advantageous to have a state medical school. Leaders in the Arkansas Medical Society argued that physicians should be trained in the state. Remember that there was no medical school in the state, and so the physicians, those who wanted to be physicians, would go to St. Louis, New Orleans, Nashville, outside of the state, and there was no guarantee that they would come back to the state. So city and other city and state officials agreed, yes, there needed to be a medical school in the state. The question was, where should it be located? Of course, the University of Arkansas, then known as Arkansas Industrial University, had been established in 1871 in Fayetteville. So there were some who said that it needed to be associated, the medical school, of course, needed to be associated with a higher education institution. But Pulaski County physicians said that the medical school did not need to be up in Fayetteville in the northwest part of the state. It needed to be in the central part of the state. And they pushed for the school to be located specifically in Little Rock, as they noted it, which was the business, governmental, and medical center of the state. Little Rock had the most physicians at that time. The Arkansas Gazette newspaper noted that, quote, "A medical college will add a material interest to our growing city. It will attract students from a wide circle, not limited by state lines, and aid directly this rapidly increasing commercial center," end quote. Now, at the time, the only college in Little Rock was St. John's College, a Masonic institution, which was located near the U.S. Arsenal, which is now MacArthur Park, of course. St. John's had been established in the early 1850s, and the building completed in 1857. So if you're familiar with Little Rock and MacArthur Park, it just stood just to the east of MacArthur Park, about where the UA Little Rock Law School now stands. So, but St. John's was not really in a position to host or have a medical school. Its growth had been stunted because of the Civil War. When Little Rock fell to the Federal Army in 1863, the college was commandeered to serve as a U.S. hospital, which became the first hospital, temporary though it was, became the first hospital in Arkansas. So obviously, teaching also ceased at St. John's during its use as a hospital. And even after the Civil War and the college was returned to the Masons, it really never regained its educational foothold. So while St. John's was considered for the state's first medical school, the organizers soon realized that the Masonic institution was woefully inadequate to educate would-be physicians. So they began to look somewhere else. Well, the only other big institution in Arkansas was on Arkansas Industrial University, which had been founded in 1871. So the thinking was that the new school, the new medical school, could be associated with the university, but they didn't know exactly how to work out all those details. So how would it be affiliated with Arkansas Industrial University, but located in Little Rock? So they came up with this idea. The 8 physicians, who later became known as the founders of the medical school, began negotiations with university officials. In late July 1879, the Arkansas Industrial University Board approved the use of the Arkansas Industrial University name with the medical department. So AIU Medical Department. The new school, though, was only affiliated with the university and not a formal part of AIU. This medical school in its early beginnings was a proprietary school. Students purchased, the 8 founders owned the school. They charged the students tuition and fees, and the students would buy tickets to attend lectures that they wanted to attend. And also because of this agreement, the university, of course, would not assume any financial responsibility for the medical school's support. So the 8 doctors that are on your screen right now formed a private stock company called Arkansas Industrial University Medical Department. P.O. Hooper, Roscoe Jennings, Claiborne Watkins, Edwin Bentley, Augustus L. Brysocker, James Dibbrell, James Southall, and John J. McAlmont. Those 8 are considered the founders of UAMS, the medical school. They each put in money and, as I mentioned, were proprietors of the school. So now that they had approval, they could use the AIU name, they had to find a building. Where was the school going to be? Where were the students going to attend? And they really had to hurry up and find a building because they were preparing for the fall opening session of 1879, remember the trustees of the board voted in July of 1879 to grant the use of AIU name. And so they wanted to start in September, which was only a couple of months away. So these 8 physicians, they looked at existing buildings in Little Rock, and they soon focused on the former Sparandio restaurant. It was less than 10 years old. It had been built in 1873 on 2nd Street between Main and Louisiana streets by Ferrari Sparandio, a local restaurateur. And the 3-story building that he built was considered one of the finest in the state. And the restaurant itself was highly regarded for its food and availability of fine wines. But for some unknown reasons, the Sparandio restaurant failed in 1875. While this was bad news for Mr. Sparandio in the Little Rock restaurant scene, the empty building became an opportunity 4 years later for medical school supporters. So these 8 physicians pooled their resources together, and they successfully purchased the Sparandio building for $5,000 to use as the medical school. Each doctor, $625, which was no small sum at the time. Today, that would be the equivalent to paying about $16,000 each, for a total of over $128,000 for the building. Now, all 8 of the initial investors of the medical school were distinguished physicians in Little Rock. All were Civil War veterans, and all led interesting lives and are deserving of individual programs. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to go give extensive biographies of them. For example, in addition to his role in the creation of the medical school, Dr. Brysocker in 1880 delivered a future U.S. general, Douglas MacArthur, in the Arsenal building at MacArthur Park, the grounds. Dr. Dibbrell James Dibbrell loved new inventions, and his house at 1400 Spring Street, which is still standing, is known as the Gadget House. It was known as the Gadget House because Dr. Dibbrell was interested in early inventions and all these gadgets for the house, including doorbells, burglar alarms, and central heating. Now, Edwin Bentley was a native of Connecticut, and his medical career mainly consisted of appointments at various U.S. hospitals around the country, including the Little Rock Barracks, where he was assigned in 1878. So he was in Little Rock in 1879 to help found the medical school. An interesting story that goes with Dr. Bentley, it happened before he came to Little Rock, but it's so curious and so interesting that I always include it in this presentation. So in 1869, about 10 years before he moved to Little Rock, there was an administrator's sale of his personal effects of a man who lived in Dr. Bentley's former house in Norwich, Connecticut. And during the sale, a 15-gallon keg was put up for sale, but no one purchased it. And so later on, an individual purchased all the unpurchased items, and he was moving this keg. And he noted that the keg was heavier than he thought it should be. So there was a stop in it, and so he unstopped it and the fluid, and he turned it over and let the fluid inside out, left it to drain. And so he lifted it back up and corked it back up, and he started moving it again, and it was still heavier than he thought it should be. And so he opened it up, and inside this barrel, this keg, he discovered an assortment of hands, feet, and arms. The city officials in Norwich, after they were told of this discovery, feared that a serial killer had been living in their midst. But it was soon realized and remembered that Dr. Bentley, during the Civil War, had sent amputated parts back to Connecticut for use in the medical school. They had been stored in this keg and left and had been forgotten, apparently, in this basement. So that's always an interesting story with Dr. Bentley. And in fact, in the Historical Research Center's collection, we have a scrapbook of intestines that Dr. Bentley compiled for cases of soldiers dealing with typhoid and other sorts of disease. And so he was always interested in teaching about diseases, and apparently he went the extra mile to send parts back to Connecticut. So let's get back to the school. So the opening session of the newly created medical department began on October 3rd, 1879, with an enrollment of 23 men. While some women had applied to the medical department, their applications had been denied because of their gender. But the semester was an abbreviated one. It only lasted 5 months. So on March 3rd, 1880, the first commencement of the new school was held. There was one graduate, Dr. Tom Pinson, and he was presented with a borrowed sheepskin diploma since his had not yet arrived. But despite the low student count of that first semester, the school was considered a success, and the Gazette noted at the beginning of the second year that, quote, the college is in a healthy and flourishing condition, end quote. Clinical education in the Sperandeo, what had been the Sperandeo restaurant, was held in the nearby Phones Brothers hardware building, which was just across the alley. So they had they did their clinical work in a hardware warehouse. By 1890, 109 physicians had graduated from the new school, and the interest was so high that a new school was constructed at the corner of 2nd and Sherman Streets. Now, despite this success, though, there was still distrust in the need in the rural areas of Arkansas for a medical school. In fact, the Arkansas House of Representatives in 1882 even passed a resolution declaring, quote, medicine and surgery are humbugs, and all medical colleges should be declared nuisances and injurious, end quote. The new building at 2nd and Sherman Streets cost about $15,000, was 3 stories high, and included a lecture hall and amphitheater with dissection rooms on the 3rd floor. Now, the medical department entered the 20th century flush with success. In 1901, the school graduated its first female graduate, Mrs. Annie Shoppick. In 1906, though, a new medical school in Little Rock was established, so there was competition now in Little Rock for the education of doctors. Known as the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and remember, this was not the same College of Physicians and Surgeons that had been established as part of that rift with the County Medical Society. So the incorporators of the College of Physicians and Surgeons were doctors and pharmacists not associated with the UA Medical Department. It was housed in the former Maddox Seminary for females, and the hospital provided competition for the still young medical school. The city of Little Rock, though, as you can imagine, could not adequately support 2 medical schools, and so the quality at both schools suffered as a result. By 1909, the Arkansas Medical Society called for the merger of the 2 medical schools. In 1911, the College of Physicians and Surgeons and the Department of Medicine agreed to combine their resources, mainly based on a 1910 report by Abraham Flexner. Commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation, the report analyzed the quality of medical education throughout the U.S. The Flexner report was not kind to either of the medical schools in Little Rock, citing their lack of clinical facilities and instructional materials. In his summary, Flexner wrote, quote, both the Arkansas schools are local institutions in a state that has at this date 3 times as many doctors as it needs. Neither has a single redeeming feature. It is incredible that the state university should permit its name to shelter one of them. The general education interest of the state require that the state university, now inconveniently located at Fayetteville, should be moved to Little Rock. Once there, it could probably get possession of both schools and organize something better than either, end quote. Of course, while the University of Arkansas did not move from Fayetteville, there was, of course, opposition to that. It finally did officially incorporate the medical department, which had been using its name for the last 32 years. Both the College of Physicians and Surgeons and the incorporators, or their heirs, transferred the physical property to the U of A. So the College of Physicians and Surgeons, the people who had incorporated that school, the incorporators of the medical department of the University of Arkansas, transferred all the physical property over to the University of Arkansas. So from that point on, all graduates of both institutions were considered graduates of the University of Arkansas. So that's when you read something and you see if someone graduated from the College of Physicians and Surgeons, they're considered an alumnus of UAMS. Now, even though this consolidation was supported and it happened, new money from the legislature did not come or from the university come to this new school, this new cohesive school. Now in 1913, the Arkansas legislature passed a resolution to make the old State House available for use as a medical school. The legislature had recently moved into the just built Arkansas Capitol. Now, while the old State House was not, as you can imagine, not very conducive to a medical school, it was used until 1935 as a preclinical instruction, while the second and Sherman site was used for clinical work. But finally, during that time when they made the old State House available for the medical school, the legislature finally appropriated some money, $36,000, for the school maintenance. Now, clinical facilities, which had been lacking all this time, you know, they were doing preclinical instruction in the old State House and the clinical work in the second and Sherman site. That finally came to fruition in 1935 when a new medical school designed by local architect H. Ray Burks was built at 12th and McAlmont downtown. Instrumental in this new school was Dr. Frank Visenholler. Visenholler was dean of the School of Medicine from 1927 to 1939, and he was really the driving force in securing funds to build the new 6-story school on Dr. Edwin Bentley's home site, former home site. The city of Little Rock, recognizing the need for a hospital and clinical facilities for the school, especially since the school had lost its accreditation earlier because of the lack of clinical availability, the city of Little Rock completed a new city hospital adjacent to the medical school. The new city hospital served indigent patients. So for the first time in its history, the medical school was a center instead of just a school. Now, September 1951, also, we're moving forward, saw the establishment of a new division of the medical school, the creation of the School of Pharmacy. Housed first in the graduate building at 12th and Lewis Streets, the school moved to the new campus when it was completed in 1957. This is the campus on Markham, which we're going to be talking about in a few minutes. The School of Pharmacy graduated its first class in 1952. So you're probably wondering, well, how did they graduate a class in 1952 when they just opened in 1951? And that was because they had transfers from the College of the Ozarks, which had operated the only pharmacy school in Arkansas at the time. So the School of Pharmacy at the College of the Ozarks in Clarksville closed. Those transferred to Little Rock to the new School of Pharmacy. And then in 1957, 2 years after the pharmacy school opened, School of Nursing opened. So UAMS is expanding beyond doctors. They're now including pharmacists and nurses. So by 1946, the facilities at the McAlmont location were stretched, and leaders began to look for other locations for the medical school. Downtown Little Rock, which had been where all the previous medical schools had been located, did not have the available land needed to build not only a medical school, but also a hospital component. So West Little Rock at that time became an option. So West Little Rock at that time really didn't extend further than University Avenue, which was then known as Hayes Street. Unused property that was part of the State Hospital for Nervous Diseases, which was located on Markham Street, was proposed. So university officials started the long process to raise money and interest in this new project, the construction of a new school. Early support came in 1949 from newly elected Governor Sid McMath, who urged the construction of a new medical center. Later that same year, the state legislature authorized construction of the school, and in 1951, the legislature voted a 2 cents a package increase on cigarettes to help fund the project. Now, internationally known and Arkansas native architect Edward Durrell Stone drew up the plans for the modern new facility, the facility that we now know known as UAMS, the original hospital there. Stone, though, was not the first architect chosen for the new facility. Originally, Bruce Anderson, a Little Rock architect and business partner of H. Ray Burks, who had designed the McAlmont Medical School, but who had passed away in early 1948, his partner, Bruce Anderson, had been chosen to draw up the plans for this medical school. But for some reason, in early 1949, the U of A Board of Trustees voted to give the architectural contract to the Little Rock firm of Earhart, Eichenbaum, and Rausch, who later brought in Ed Stone from New York. Ed Stone was as I mentioned, internationally known. He had designed these buildings. He designed the U.S. Pavilion during the Brussels World Fair in the late 1930s. So he was well known. He was also friends with U.S. Senator William J. Fulbright. So most likely, this politics played into this appointment of switching from Bruce Anderson to the Little Rock firm and then Edward Durrell Stone. Now, Stone's medical school plans, he had 2 construction components. The first one was a 450 bed capacity hospital, and then separately an educational wing. So construction began on the hospital in 1951, and that facility opened in 1956. The educational component of this plan, the educational building, that's where the classes would have been taught, now known as the Shorey Building, was opened a year after the hospital opened in 1957. The campus kept building, kept expanding. In 1959, a 10-story student dormitory and student union opened. And for the first time in its history, single and married students had housing on the medical school campus. Named for Jeff Banks, a longtime and much loved anatomy professor in the College of Medicine, who had died right before the building opened. The dormitory and student union provided recreational opportunities. The student union offered a lounge, game, music rooms, conference room, barber shop, and a coffee shop. But despite the proximity to classes, sometimes convenience was not available at the dorm because air conditioning was not added to the building until the early 1970s. So you can imagine living in that dorm during Arkansas summer and not having any air conditioning probably was brutal. As I mentioned, it did have a lounge. It was an ultra-modern lounge, which sort of it fit in with the original Ed Stone design. He did not design this building, but it fit in with the rest of the buildings, the educational wing and the hospital that he had designed. The lounge featured a large modernist chandelier, and it served, this dorm served as student housing until 2009, when it was demolished to make room for the new hospital. Now, as it is today, recreation and extracurricular activities are important to de-stress from the daily medical classes. Of course, there were sports at the medical school, and they had been encouraged since the very beginning. In the early 1900s, both baseball and football teams were fielded at the medical school. They were the sports teams were known as the UA Medics, and the baseball team actually won second place in the 1910 City Interscholastic League, losing only 2 games that season, but both of them to Little Rock High School. Now, if sports weren't your thing, a medical school student could also try their hand at band, which they had a band at the school as well. Now, the classroom and the hospital rooms and the sports, they were not the only places where learning happened. For many, Peck's Drive-In, located just across the street, located across Markham, just a few yards west of the medical school. If you know the area, it's where the Taco Bell is located. Peck's was just as important to the doctor's education as was the medical school. Established in the late 1940s, many a medical student ended their day at Peck's. Often touted as having, quote, the coldest beer in town, end quote, Peck's still evokes strong memories for those who remember it, not only for the beer, but also the shuffleboard and the camaraderie. One professor of radiology and a graduate of the medical school, who was interviewed for a newspaper article, believed that he matured not only from the formal education at UAMS, but also through his time at Peck's. Quote, I just sort of grew up at Peck's, end quote, he says. I learned a lot of lessons in life. They're almost as important as my medical degree. Now, in that interview, that same doctor lamented that he did not have a diploma, saying that he had graduated with honors from Peck's. And there are still some folks who haven't forgiven the then owner for closing the drive-in, or they probably will not frequent that Taco Bell because they replaced Peck's. So Peck's has a very fabled history in the UAMS story. In 1973, the Arkansas State Legislature authorized the creation of the Area Health Education Centers, formerly known as AHECs, as part of Governor Dale Bumper's state plan for primary health care. Their purpose was to focus on medically underserved areas around the state, bolster efforts to retain more of the graduates from the medical school, and to provide more training opportunities for the students. The 6 AHECs were established in the state: Fayetteville, Fort Smith, Texarkana, El Dorado, Pine Bluff, and Jonesboro from late 1973 to 75. Today, these centers still fulfill their original mission. They're known as regional centers today. And after 97 years as part of the University of Arkansas Fayetteville, the school, of course, started out as a proprietary school. It was officially taken into the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, 1911. But finally, in 1976, the School of Medicine became its own individual campus, known as the University of Arkansas Medical Sciences. With this new status came a new chancellor. Dr. James L. Dennis became the first chancellor of UAMS. Now, construction, if you've ever been on UAMS campus, you probably will say that construction has been a constant on the campus for years. And it's true that UAMS keeps building. In 1985, the Arkansas Cancer Research Center was built, later expanded and named after Lieutenant Governor Winthrop Rockefeller. In 1994, A new eye institute named after Springdale trucking magnate Harvey Jones and his philanthropist wife Bernice was built. 10 years later, the Pat Walker Tower of the Institute was dedicated, of the Eye Institute. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in 2009, the new hospital was dedicated, and it stands where the old Jeff Banks Dormitory and Student Union once stood. The Northwest Campus was dedicated in 2009 as well, and so the list goes on. Of course, this is an incomplete list, and UAMS continues to grow and expand their facilities and their programs. Now, through the years, UAMS has produced world-class and well-known physicians, and these are just a sampling of some of the groundbreakers that have come from UAMS. Gordon Wassel, class of 1909, received the Navy Cross for saving 12 fellow soldiers from capture by the Japanese on the island of Java during World War II. Later, his story was made into a movie starring Gary Cooper. Dr. Samuel L. Kuntz was a pioneering kidney transplantation surgeon, originally from Lexa, Arkansas, over in the Mississippi Delta, and he graduated from UAMS in 1958. He performed a kidney transplant operation on live television on the Today program in 1976. You had Dr. Masaki Hara, who was professor of surgery at the medical school. He performed the first open heart surgery in Arkansas in 1957. 2 years later, he performed the first bypass operation in the state. Later, in the mid-1960s, he helped establish the College of Medicine kidney transplant team. You also had Ida Jo Brooks, who did not actually graduate from the medical school because her admission was denied because of her gender. So she was not allowed to she was not admitted to the medical school. Nevertheless, she persisted and she became the first female faculty member at the medical school in 1914. So even though she was not admitted to the school, she still came back and made history at this school that had denied her admission by becoming the first female faculty member. And of course, we have Dr. Edith Irby Jones, who died last year, recently integrated, who died last year. She integrated UAMS in 1948 and was its first African-American graduate in 1952. Likewise, UAMS graduated Dr. Joycelyn Elders, former U.S. Surgeon General from 1993 to 1994. She, of course, is formidable in her own right, but she has cited Dr. Jones' determination and her admission into UAMS as her guidance and support in her own career. So the UAMS that we know today was built through hard work, dedication, leadership, and determination. It has always been an asset to Arkansas, not only in educating future doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and other health professionals, but also providing much needed access to medical care for countless of Arkansans. And of course, during this COVID-19 pandemic, UAMS has been instrumental in providing care for Arkansans. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to open it up to questions. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to use the chat. If the chat box is not open, you should have a menu bar at the top. You might have to hover a little bit. There might be a little more with the ... more. It might be under there, but if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. I'm going to type my email in the chat box, and if anyone has any questions that you want to, if you think of something later and you want to shoot me an email, you're more than welcome to do so, and I will be happy to answer as best I can. What's the proportion of female to male students now? I don't know the exact numbers to that. There might be someone at this presentation who might be able to answer that. It's certainly not as many as many females as there should be in medical school, and of course the proportion of African Americans to the white doctors or white students is horribly low. I will find out the answer to the proportion of female to male students, though, and I will let you know. When did PECS close? I think PECS closed in the, was it the 1990s, I believe? I think it was the 1990s. So UAMS was essentially a department of UA based in Little Rock before it was appointed the chancellor. Yes, it was a part of the UA Fayetteville campus, but it was just another college or school, but it was based in Little Rock. But it was all administratively, it was part of the U of A campus. So for the incoming class, M1 class, there will be 103 men and 71 women. Are these pictures within the digital collection on the Historical Research Center website? Yes, most of these photographs that I've shown you today is on the Historical Research Center has a digital repository, and if you go to the if you do a Google search, you can just do the Historical Research Center digital collections, and it will come up. But all of these, most of these photographs that I've used in this presentation are on that digital site. There are some, of course, not all of our photographs have been digitized, but most of them from this presentation have been on that site. If anyone wants to come down, right now we're not open to the general public because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but if anyone wants to come down after we reopen to the public, please feel free and I'll be glad to give you a tour. And Susan Steelman has posted the link to the digital collection, so everyone should be able to see that in their chat box. Thank you, Susan, for doing that. Any other questions? Okay, well, we'll look forward to seeing you. The next stay-at-home lecture is going to be on July 2nd. We do not have a, I have to announce the speaker. We have not, the speaker that I had, unfortunately, had to reschedule. So I'll be announcing what the next presentation is on July 2nd, but I hope that you all will be able to attend. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to email me. You can call me up if you'd like to do that as well. And I appreciate you all being here, and I will see you next time.